At 6:17 a.m. on August 6, 1945, a single number sealed Japan's fate. 31,000 feet above the city of Hiroshima, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay cut silently through the morning haze. Its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, stared ahead as sunlight glinted off the wings of his aircraft. Below him, the city was waking. School children walking to class, street vendors arranging their goods, soldiers moving through narrow alleys, unaware that in less than 1 minute the sky would open and history itself would split in two. The mission had begun hours earlier at Tinian Island, where the crew had been briefed not on what they were carrying, but on what it would mean. The weapon, called Little Boy, weighed 9,700 pounds and held within it the concentrated power of an entire war. To the scientists of the Manhattan Project, it was a triumph of physics. To Tibbets, it was simply the bomb that would end everything. As the bomber approached the target, Major Thomas Farabee adjusted his Norden bomb sight, aligning crosshairs over the Aoi Bridge, the X at the center of Hiroshima. The city spread below like a map, neat, fragile, almost innocent. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Tibbets gave the order. The bomb bay doors opened. Bomb away. The moment the bomb fell, time seemed to fracture. Little Boy dropped for 43 seconds, spinning lazily through the air before detonating 600 meters above the ground. The explosion released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The city vanished in a sphere of white fire. The shockwave traveled faster than sound, faster than thought. Buildings turned to dust. Shadows burned into walls. People disappeared where they stood. Within seconds, 80,000 lives were gone. From the cockpit of Enola Gay, the crew watched in stunned silence. The rising column of smoke was not gray, but a deep, living color, red, black, violet, twisting into a mushroom shape that seemed to pierce the heavens. "My God," one crewman whispered, "what have we done?" Tibbets said nothing. Below them, Hiroshima burned. Over the radio came a single message. Results good. Visual sighting excellent. It was the language of war. Efficient, emotionless, and final. In Tokyo, the news reached the Imperial General Headquarters within hours. At first, the reports were dismissed as exaggerated. A single bomb could not destroy an entire city. But as reconnaissance photos arrived, the truth was undeniable. Hiroshima no longer existed. The Emperor's advisors gathered in silence. Japan's dream of holding the line, of negotiating peace with honor, evaporated in an instant. But even then, surrender was unthinkable. Prime Minister Suzuki and the Supreme War Council clung to a fading hope that the United States had built only one such bomb. They were wrong. 3 days later, another B-29, Boxcar, lifted off from Tinian. Its target was Kokura, but thick clouds forced the crew to divert to their secondary objective, Nagasaki. The weapon this time was Fat Man, a plutonium implosion bomb even more powerful than Little Boy. At 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, it exploded over the city's industrial valley. 70,000 more lives were erased in an instant. From the ashes, only silence remained. And yet, after 2 cities were destroyed, Japan's leaders hesitated. The army insisted on fighting to the last man, preparing for a homeland invasion that would cost millions of lives. Then came the final blow, not from America, but from the North. On August 8th, between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and unleashed 1 million soldiers into Manchuria. The empire was cornered. There were no cards left to play. On August 10th, Emperor Hirohito broke centuries of tradition and intervened directly in government decisions. He told his ministers that continuing the war would mean the extinction of the Japanese people. For the first time in history, a divine ruler spoke the word surrender. But even that was not enough. The military tried to stage a coup to prevent the emperor's recorded message from being broadcast. They failed. And on August 15, 1945, the voice of the emperor echoed through every radio in Japan. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he said, his tone calm, detached, almost godlike. We must endure the unendurable. In that moment, the Empire of Japan ceased to exist. The number that doomed Japan was not 1, not 2, not even 3. It was the sum of every decision, every illusion, every refusal to see the end coming. The bombs were merely the final punctuation in a story that had already written itself in blood. In the days that followed the emperor's broadcast, Japan became a country of ghosts. Cities lay silent under a gray sky, smoke still rising from the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Trains stood frozen on broken tracks. Across the countryside, villagers gathered around crackling radios, trying to understand words they had never imagined hearing. Surrender, defeat, occupation. For years they had been told that Japan was divine, eternal, undefeatable. Now, that illusion had been burned away by a light brighter than the sun. In Tokyo, the imperial palace stood untouched by bombs, but heavy with shame. Emperor Hirohito moved through its halls like a shadow, his once untouchable image now fragile, human, almost tragic. The surrender had not yet been signed, but the war was already over in every heart that still beat. On August 17th, 2 days after the broadcast, General Douglas MacArthur received word that the Japanese government had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The Allied world exhaled for the first time in 4 years. Yet peace was not immediate. Japan was a nation on the edge of collapse, its economy shattered, its people starving, its cities reduced to cinders. The once mighty imperial army refused to vanish overnight. Some officers talked of resisting even after surrender, of retreating to the mountains to wage a guerrilla war for honor. But there was no honor left to defend. The people had nothing. In Hiroshima, doctors treated survivors of the atomic blast with whatever they could find. Fish oil for burns, river water for thirst. They called it the rain of Black Death. Skin peeled from flesh like paper. Hair fell out in handfuls, and the air itself smelled of iron and sorrow. At night, the survivors whispered to each other about the flash, the fire, the silence that followed. The sky fell, one girl said. It fell and never went back. In Nagasaki, the bells of Urakami Cathedral still hung twisted and blackened, but the faithful gathered beneath them to pray. For the first time, they prayed not for victory, but for forgiveness. On August 30th, the first Allied planes appeared over Tokyo, their silver wings reflecting the morning sun. People looked up in silence. There were no sirens this time, no flak, no gunfire. The enemy had become the savior, the destroyer, now the deliverer. When General MacArthur landed at Atsugi Airfield, he stepped out of his aircraft without a helmet, without a weapon. The message was clear. The war was over. He had nothing left to fear. Japanese officers saluted stiffly, their faces blank. Behind their composure, humiliation burned. For the first time in centuries, foreign boots touched the soil of the empire. 2 days later, on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japan's final act of surrender took place. The deck was lined with officers from every Allied nation, Americans, British, Chinese,
Australians, Soviets, all gathered to witness the empire's fall. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with history. When Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu approached the table to sign the document, he walked with a cane, his limp a souvenir from an assassination attempt years earlier. His hand trembled as he lifted the pen. "We hereby surrender unconditionally," he said softly. Behind him, General Yoshijiro Umezu signed in silence. When it was MacArthur's turn, he stood tall, his pipe between his teeth, his uniform immaculate. "It is my earnest hope," he said, "that this day will mark the beginning of a better understanding between all the peoples of the world." His voice carried across the deck, across the bay, across the ghosts of millions. As the documents were exchanged, a formation of B-29 bombers roared overhead, not in war, but in peace, a salute to the dead and the living. Below deck, the Japanese officers bowed low, their eyes fixed on the floor. The empire that had begun with divine ambition now ended with human exhaustion. Yet, even in defeat, Japan's story was not finished. Something deeper was beginning, a transformation that would rebuild the nation from ashes, guided not by the sword, but by survival. What the bombs destroyed, the spirit would rebuild. But first, the nation would have to face its reflection in the ruins. Japan after surrender was a land without sound. The air still carried the smell of burnt cities. Wood, metal, and flesh mingled into one scent that never quite faded. From Hokkaido to Kyushu, the once proud empire lay in ruins, its skyline flattened, its people walking like shadows through streets that no longer had names. Over 60 major cities had been bombed, and in their place were only ashes and silence. Trains no longer ran, markets were empty. The black market became the heartbeat of survival, where rice was traded for cigarettes and pride was traded for a few spoonfuls of sugar. In Tokyo, whole families lived inside the shells of bombed-out buildings, sleeping under collapsed beams with the sky as their ceiling. Children scavenged for nails and wire among the ruins, melting them down to sell as scrap. Every night, the wind carried the same whisper through the broken walls. "We lost everything, but we are still here." For the soldiers returning from distant fronts, China, Burma, the Pacific Islands, the journey home was worse than war itself. They arrived to find nothing waiting for them. No home, no salary, no emperor's glory, only hunger. Some had lost limbs, others had lost faith. They were greeted not as heroes, but as relics of a nightmare everyone wanted to forget. Many turned to black market gangs or roamed the countryside in silence, their uniforms ragged, their eyes hollow. The war had taken everything from them, even their purpose. In Hiroshima, the survivors called themselves Hibakusha, the bombed ones. They lived between two worlds, not dead, but not fully alive. Their bodies bore scars that never healed, their skin blotched and burned by invisible radiation. Doctors had no name for the sickness that spread, hair falling out in clumps, gums bleeding, fevers rising without cause. It was as if death had remained in the air long after the blast. Mothers buried their children in gardens that no longer bloomed. The survivors spoke softly, almost in apology for existing. "We are the ones who were left behind, but we are not sure why." Amidst this devastation, the occupation began. American soldiers in clean uniforms walked through the ruins, their boots clinking against broken stone. For the first time, Japan saw its conquerors not as faceless enemies, but as human beings, tall, confident, and strangely kind. They brought food, medicine, and cigarettes, but also rules. The rising sun flag was banned, the old songs silenced. The language of war was replaced by the language of rebuilding. Under General Douglas MacArthur's leadership, Japan was remade not with weapons, but with words and laws. The emperor renounced his divinity. Women were given the right to vote, censorship was lifted, and democracy, a foreign idea to most, began to take root among the ruins. Still, the wounds of the past did not heal easily. For many Japanese, the surrender had been a humiliation deeper than hunger. They had been raised to believe that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. Now they were asked to live for him instead. Suicide rates soared. Soldiers who could not bear defeat took their own lives quietly in forests and fields. Priests held ceremonies for the dead that never seemed to end, while mothers stitched new clothes from old uniforms, whispering prayers into every seam. Yet beneath the grief, a strange kind of strength began to grow, not the violent pride of the empire, but the quiet resilience of a people determined to rise again. In Hiroshima, amid the ruins, a group of students began to plant flowers in the cracks of the pavement. They said, "We will make something bloom." And they did. Green shoots pushed through the ash. Trees sprouted where shadows had been burned into the ground. Life, fragile and stubborn, refused to die. The world looked at Japan then as a defeated nation, but those who walked through its ruins saw something else, a country learning, painfully, how to be human again. The silence was not emptiness anymore. It was waiting, waiting for a rebirth that even the victors could not yet imagine.
On a quiet morning in late September 1945, two men met for the first time. One represented the conqueror, the other the conquered. Yet in that single room, they began shaping the rebirth of an entire nation. General Douglas MacArthur, tall and deliberate in his khaki uniform, stood by the window of the U.S. Embassy residence in Tokyo as Emperor Hirohito entered. The moment was electric with contradiction. The divine ruler of Japan, once worshipped as a living god, now bowing before a soldier of democracy. Hirohito, dressed in a plain morning coat, looked fragile, almost spectral, his hands trembling slightly as he removed his hat. "I've come," he said softly, "to offer myself to the judgment of the victors." MacArthur studied him for a moment, the man who had led Japan's people into a war that had killed tens of millions, standing now with the posture of humility, but the eyes of quiet endurance. There were no photographers at first, no sound, only the clicking of boots on marble and the slow rhythm of translation. MacArthur broke the silence. "Your Majesty," he said, "you have nothing to fear. We are not here to destroy, but to build." When they finally posed for a photograph, the image captured the paradox of post-war Japan. MacArthur towering casually beside the emperor, hands on hips, while Hirohito stood stiff and small, dressed formally, his face expressionless. The photograph was printed in every Japanese newspaper, and it sent a shockwave through the nation. For the first time, the emperor was seen not as a god, but as a man. For some, it was humiliation. For others, liberation. MacArthur understood something that many of his fellow officers did not. If Japan was to be rebuilt, it could not be done through punishment alone. He saw in Hirohito a symbol, fragile, yes, but necessary. To destroy him would be to destroy Japan's soul. Instead, he turned the emperor into a bridge between the old world and the new, allowing the people to transfer their loyalty from divine power to democratic hope. Under MacArthur's direction, Japan began an extraordinary transformation. A new constitution was written, short, precise, and revolutionary. It renounced war forever. The emperor would remain, but only as a symbol of the state, a living reminder of peace rather than conquest. Article 9, the heart of the document, forbade Japan from maintaining an army for anything other than self-defense. Hirohito, once the voice of divine will, now read carefully from English translations, approving laws drafted by foreigners. Yet even he seemed to accept this fate with grace. He made public appearances for the first time, walking among the people who once would have knelt at the mere sight of him.
Photographs showed him smiling, shaking hands with farmers, visiting orphans, bowing to widows. "I am not a god," he said in his Humanity Declaration on January 1st, 1946. "I am a human being, and so are you all." The words rippled across Japan like a second surrender, painful, necessary, and cleansing. MacArthur watched all of this unfold with the cool detachment of a man balancing empires. He admired the Japanese discipline, their obedience, their hunger to rebuild. But he also knew that beneath the politeness there lingered sorrow, guilt, and quiet pride. He once wrote, "The Japanese people are the most disciplined and cohesive society the world has ever known. They will endure this humiliation, and from it they will rise." And they did. Factories that had been turned to rubble began to hum again. American aid poured in through the Marshall Plan, not as charity, but as investment in stability. Women, newly enfranchised, voted in elections for the first time. Children returned to schools where textbooks no longer preached imperial destiny, but the dignity of peace. The transition was not smooth. Crime rose, famine loomed, and for many the memory of lost sons and burned cities still haunted every waking hour. Yet the foundation was being laid, brick by brick, word by word, between a general who refused to rule by fear and an emperor who had learned to bow before his own people. When MacArthur later described that first meeting, he said, "In that room, two worlds touched, the feudal and the free, and for a moment they understood each other." History would remember them as opposites, the conqueror and the conquered. But in truth, they were collaborators in creation. Japan's modern soul was forged not in battle, but in that fragile handshake between a man who once thought himself a god and another who believed he could remake the world.
By 1946, Japan was no longer a battlefield. It was a laboratory. The empire that had once chased conquest across Asia now turned inward, rebuilding from the dust. Cities that had been reduced to skeletons began to rise again in steel and concrete. The ruins of Tokyo became a maze of scaffolds and cranes, workers in rags carrying beams on their shoulders like soldiers without weapons. From morning until night, the air was filled with the sound of hammers and saws instead of sirens. Streets that had been silent now pulsed with life again, though every face still carried the memory of hunger. Women, many widowed by war, became the unseen architects of recovery. They ran shops, tilled soil, and rebuilt homes from the fragments of bombed wood. In their hands, survival turned into creation. The black markets that had once symbolized desperation became the seeds of a new economy. The same men who traded rice and cigarettes in the shadows would later become entrepreneurs. The economy, fragile and improvised, began to take shape under the watchful eyes of the occupation forces. MacArthur's team introduced land reforms that broke the centuries-old grip of landlords. Millions of farmers who had once worked as tenants now owned the soil they plowed. Democracy, MacArthur said, must begin at the roots. And it did, literally. Villages that had starved under feudal systems became self-sufficient. Yet rebuilding Japan was more than a physical task. It was a psychological one. The people had to unlearn the myths that had led them to war, that obedience was strength, that silence was virtue, that the emperor was divine. In classrooms, teachers replaced imperial portraits with maps of the world, showing Japan as part of humanity rather than above it. Children learned not of conquest, but of cooperation. For the first time, they recited not war oaths, but pledges of peace. "We will never again wage war," one textbook read, its words printed beneath a picture of cherry blossoms. But rebuilding peace came with its own ghosts. The Allied War Crimes Tribunals began in 1946, and the nation was forced to confront its own sins. Japanese citizens who had once cheered the war now sat in silence as the names of generals, politicians, and officers were read aloud in court. The Tokyo trials revealed atrocities that many had refused to believe: massacres in China, forced labor across Asia, human experiments in Manchuria. For the first time, Japan saw the war not through the lens of honor, but through the eyes of its victims. It was a reckoning long overdue. When Hideki Tojo, the wartime prime minister, stood before the tribunal, he bowed deeply and said, "I accept full responsibility." To many, it was the first moment of truth after years of denial. Amid this moral reconstruction, a new kind of patriotism began to grow. Not the blind devotion to empire, but a pride rooted in endurance. Artists, writers, and filmmakers captured the despair and dignity of a people reborn. Akira Kurosawa's Drunken Angel showed a Tokyo drowning in corruption, but yearning for redemption. Poets wrote of ashes and light, of rivers running black, but skies turning blue again. A generation that had lost everything began to redefine what it meant to be Japanese. It was no longer about victory or bloodline, but about perseverance, creativity, and the quiet courage to start over. By 1948, Japan's cities were still scarred, but hope had returned. Factories roared again, producing bicycles, radios, and sewing machines instead of rifles. Trade with the United States revived, and American food aid filled empty shelves. In Tokyo, neon signs flickered to life for the first time in years, casting color onto faces that had forgotten how to smile. The occupation had not erased Japan, it had remade it. The people who had once fought to die for the emperor now worked to live for themselves. And through it all, the emperor watched in silence. Hirohito made more public appearances, walking among construction sites and schools, speaking softly about peace. His words, once divine commands, had become something gentler, an apology stretched across a generation. "The path ahead will be long," he said in one broadcast, "but from suffering, strength is born." By the end of 1949, that strength was visible. The population was recovering. The streets were alive again. The scars of war remained, but they no longer defined the nation. They reminded it. In the space where bombs had fallen, new dreams were being built. Japan was becoming something no one expected: a democracy forged in defeat, powered not by conquest, but by endurance.
By 1950, Japan was breathing again, but its lungs were filled with the air of another nation. The rising hum of factories, the busy markets, the laughter of children returning to school, all of it existed under the long, unmistakable shadow of the United States. The occupation had begun as an armistice and transformed into an experiment, a laboratory where America tested the power of democracy on the ruins of empire. General MacArthur ruled from his Tokyo headquarters not as a conqueror, but as something stranger, an emperor of democracy, his word law, his vision absolute. The Japanese called him the blue-eyed shogun. His staff filtered every decree, every film, every newspaper before it reached the people. American censorship banned talk of atomic devastation or criticism of the occupation, yet Western music filled the airwaves. In Ginza, jazz poured from radio speakers in dance halls, a new rhythm for a nation learning how to forget. The paradox was everywhere. American soldiers patrolled streets once guarded by imperial troops, now smiling, handing out chocolate to children who bowed deeply in return. The same hands that dropped bombs now offered bread. It was an uneasy peace built on contradiction. The Japanese admired their occupiers' energy, their machines, their confidence, but they also envied and resented them. Behind every gesture of cooperation lay a quiet humiliation. Japan had been remade, but not entirely by choice. The stars and stripes fluttered over government buildings. Coca-Cola signs appeared beside shrines. American movies played in rebuilt theaters, replacing samurai epics with westerns. To many, the war had ended, only to be replaced by a softer conquest, the conquest of culture. Yet, amid this occupation, something unexpected happened. The Americans did not crush Japan's identity, they fertilized it. The exposure to Western ideas unleashed a creative explosion unlike anything the country had known. Young writers read Hemingway and Dostoevsky. Artists studied abstract expressionism and jazz. Women who had once been voiceless found strength in democracy's promise. They entered universities, joined local councils, and spoke openly for the first time about equality. The old hierarchies were cracking, and through those cracks, light began to pour in. But in 1950, the world shifted again. The Korean War erupted, and Japan found itself pulled back into the machinery of global conflict, this time as a supplier, not a soldier. American troops poured through its ports, using Yokohama and Sasebo as staging grounds. Japanese factories, once silent, now thundered day and night producing supplies for the U.S. military: steel, uniforms, engines. The economic miracle that later would define Japan began not with peace, but with another war. Prosperity rose from blood once again. "We lost the war, but we won the peace," one businessman said. MacArthur's influence reached its peak during these years. To the Japanese, he was both savior and symbol, a foreigner who had tamed their chaos and given them structure. When he was suddenly relieved of command in April 1951, after clashing with President Truman over Korea, Japan went into mourning. Crowds gathered outside the U.S. Embassy, weeping as if a monarch had died. Hirohito himself sent a private note of thanks. It read, "You gave my people back their dignity." When MacArthur left Tokyo, he looked out from the deck of his plane at the city below, glittering like a sea of light, and whispered, "They will do well." After his departure, Japan stood alone for the first time since surrender. The American occupation officially ended in 1952 with the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. As American flags were lowered, a quiet unease settled over the nation. The protector was gone, but his shadow remained. Japan was independent again, on paper. In reality, the U.S. military never left. Bases dotted the islands from Okinawa to Hokkaido, the hum of American jets blending with the sounds of Japan's rebirth. To many, the new peace felt conditional, borrowed. "We traded one emperor for another," one writer observed bitterly. And yet the partnership endured. America's protection allowed Japan to focus on rebuilding its economy without rearming. Factories turned from producing weapons to radios, cameras, and automobiles. Within a decade, Made in Japan would transform from a mark of cheap goods to a symbol of precision and progress. The American shadow had not erased Japan, it had sharpened its outline. Beneath the surface of dependency, something fierce and uniquely Japanese was stirring again. The land that had once been defined by war was now learning to conquer through innovation. Steel replaced swords. Circuits replaced bullets. And in the humming glow of neon Tokyo, beneath the towering signs and the smell of oil and rain, Japan's true post-war miracle began, not in defiance of America, but in reflection of it.
By the late 1950s, Japan had begun to hum again, not with the march of soldiers, but with the pulse of machinery. From the ashes of war, a new rhythm filled the air. The clang of steel in Kawasaki shipyards, the whir of sewing machines in Osaka, the distant echo of assembly lines in Nagoya. The country that had once chased conquest across oceans was now chasing perfection in factories. The phoenix had risen, not in flames, but in the steady spark of industry. What America had destroyed, Japan rebuilt and improved. Every broken beam, every bombed-out shell became raw material for something new. Government planners, inspired by American efficiency, yet driven by Japanese precision, drafted a blueprint for resurrection. Productivity, not patriotism, became the new national creed. Men who had once worn uniforms now wore factory caps, their battlefields replaced by conveyor belts. Women filled offices, typing reports on American-made machines while learning to master their own. In the ruins of defeat, an unspoken dream took root. If Japan could not rule the world through empire, it would do so through excellence. By 1956, the miracle was visible. Trains ran on time, neon signs flickered across Ginza. Radios filled homes with Western music and Japanese voices. Families who had once lived in burned-out shacks now gathered around electric stoves, eating white rice for the first time in years. For a nation that had known hunger, the taste of warmth itself felt like victory. But this new prosperity carried its own discipline. Work became religion. The spirit of Bushido, once used for war, was reborn in the workplace. Companies demanded loyalty that bordered on devotion. Men worked 12-hour days, returning home to children who often saw them only as shadows. The Japanese worker became both the engine and the sacrifice of the miracle. Across the Pacific, America watched in astonishment. In just 10 years, the nation it had bombed into submission was becoming its most efficient ally and competitor. Japanese cameras began flooding Western markets, followed by radios, motorcycles, and the first compact cars. The names Sony, Honda, Nikon, and Toyota began to echo across the world. Each product was more than a machine, it was an act of quiet defiance. They tried to destroy us, so we learned to build things they couldn't. But behind the glow of neon and the hum of progress, the ghosts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still lingered. The hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombings, lived quietly on society's edge. Many were shunned, their illnesses misunderstood, their pain invisible. Some called them cursed, others simply looked away. Yet their voices refused to fade. Writers, artists, and filmmakers began to confront what the government preferred to forget. In 1955, the first Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum opened. It exhibits a haunting mirror of humanity's capacity for both brilliance and cruelty. Children walked past melted glass bottles and charred school uniforms, learning not the glory of battle, but the cost of pride. That same year, the city of Hiroshima declared itself a city of peace. Its mayor stood before a crowd of survivors and said, "We will make this our message to the world, not vengeance, but warning." From the heart of destruction, Japan began to define its moral identity, not by strength, but by empathy. In classrooms, children folded paper cranes for Sadako Sasaki, the young girl who died of leukemia 10 years after the bomb, hoping to make 1,000 so she could live. She reached 644 before her death. Her classmates finished the rest. The paper crane became Japan's new flag of defiance, fragile, patient, eternal. By the 1960s, Japan's rebirth was complete. The Tokyo skyline glittered with glass and light. The 1964 Olympic Games, the first ever held in Asia, became the nation's triumphant declaration to the world: "We have returned." Trains streaked across the landscape on silver rails, their speed a symbol of the future. The world saw a nation reborn. The Japanese saw something more. A country that had walked through fire and learned how to rise from it without burning others.
But even in triumph, there was humility. The emperor, once the symbol of divinity, now stood quietly in the stadium, bowing as athletes marched past. There was no roar of conquest, no songs of empire, only applause, gentle, human, endless. It was not the sound of victory, it was the sound of peace finally finding its voice. Japan, the nation that once tried to rule the Pacific with steel, had learned to master something far more powerful: patience. In the span of 2 decades, it had transformed from the world's destroyer to its craftsman. The machine had replaced the sword, but the soul, the stubborn, disciplined, beautiful soul of Japan remained unchanged. It was the same force that had endured siege, starvation, and surrender. The same force that would carry it into a future the world could not yet imagine.
By the 1970s, Japan had become a miracle with a heartbeat made of steel and memory. The world looked at it in awe, a nation once buried under ashes now glowing with neon light, its factories roaring, its trains slicing through the dawn. But beneath the hum of progress lay something deeper, something quieter: the cost of peace. For 25 years, Japan had traded blood for balance, empire for endurance, and pride for perfection. It had become the world's workshop, but it had also built walls around its pain. The price of peace was silence. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were no longer names that made people weep. They had become symbols, polished for tourists, recited in school books, neatly contained. Yet every August, when the air grew thick and the cicadas began to cry, the nation paused. Sirens wailed across the cities at 8:15 a.m., and for 60 seconds everything stopped: factories, trains, voices, even laughter. In that minute of stillness, Japan remembered what it had chosen to forget: the moment when light erased everything. Survivors stood with their eyes closed, heads bowed, the sound of their breath mingling with the wind. "We live," one old man whispered, "because we must bear witness." That was the unspoken burden of post-war Japan, to live not just for itself, but for the world it had once nearly destroyed. The generations born after the war inherited both the guilt and the grace of their parents. They grew up surrounded by comfort, but haunted by conscience. The children of the bomb became engineers, teachers, poets. They built computers and cars, but also museums and memorials. They taught their own children that progress meant nothing without peace. For them, the lesson of 1945 was not vengeance, not punishment, but memory. The quiet conviction that some wounds must never heal completely because their ache keeps humanity awake. In the shadows of Japan's success, the American shadow remained. Military bases dotted the islands. The Treaty of Protection still tied Japan's defense to Washington. Some saw it as safety. Others saw it as a reminder that freedom, too, came with a price. The streets of Tokyo filled with protests during the 1960s as students shouted against the U.S. presence and against the complacency of prosperity. They wanted to reclaim something their parents had surrendered: the right to choose their own destiny. But even their rebellion carried the echo of restraint. Japan no longer fought with guns, it fought with ideas, with culture, with persistence. By the 1980s, the world began calling Japan an economic superpower, a nation that had conquered the globe not with soldiers, but with circuits and silicon. Yet inside that triumph was the faint hum of exhaustion. Men collapsed at their desks, victims of kiroshi, death by overwork. Families drifted apart under the weight of duty. The same discipline that had rebuilt the country was now consuming it. The phoenix had risen, yes, but it had forgotten how to rest its wings. And still, the people endured. Through recessions, earthquakes, and change, Japan carried itself with the same quiet dignity it had shown in defeat. When the bubble burst in the 1990s, when factories fell silent and the neon dimmed, the nation did not rage, it bowed, endured, and began again. The lesson learned in 1945 had never left. Destruction was not the end, it was the beginning. In Hiroshima today, near the river where the blast once reflected its impossible light, children still fold paper cranes. Tourists walk past the atomic dome, its skeletal frame standing against the sky like a witness carved in stone. Nearby, a plaque reads, "Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the evil." The words are simple, but in them lies the heart of everything Japan became. It is a promise whispered by generations who understood the true cost of peace, humility, memory, endurance. Japan's rise was not a miracle, it was an act of will. The same hands that once built weapons now build wonders. The same spirit that once marched to war now walks in silence through memorials of glass and light. The country that could not surrender learned that surrender was not the end of pride, it was the beginning of wisdom. As night falls over Tokyo, the neon lights flicker across skyscrapers, their reflections rippling in the Sumida River. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the sound of distant bells echoes through the summer air. It is the same sound that once rang over ruins, now carried by the wind over a nation reborn. Japan stands not as a conqueror, not as a victim, but as something rarer, a survivor who learned to turn pain into peace and silence into song. The phoenix still flies, its wings scarred but shining, and below it the world still watches, still learning, still remembering. Because peace, as Japan proved, is never free. It must be built every day, out of memory, out of humility, and out of the ashes of yesterday.